Ever wonder what medieval castle sieges were really like? Forget what Hollywood tells you. The reality was far more horrific, brutal, and ingenious than any movie could ever portray. Prepare to have your perception of medieval warfare shattered. You're trapped in a stone tomb with hundreds of others. It's winter. The last bag of flour was eaten 3 days ago. The wells are dark and silent now, fouled by the dead. You hear weeping in the chapel, scratching on the wooden doors, and then silence. Every morning, another body is dragged out of the hall and left to freeze in the courtyard. Outside, the enemy is laughing. They're not coming for a fight. Not yet. They want to watch you rot first. And when they grow bored, they'll send their message. A bloated corpse hurled from a trebuchet, crashing through your chapel roof. The stench of plague hits harder than any sword. This was no gallant standoff, no clean duel of noble warriors. This was a medieval siege. And it was hell. For more stories like this video, and subscribe to our channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we learn about history together from all around the world. It didn't begin with swords or fire, it began with fear. The very moment a castle spotted banners on the horizon, the colors of a rival lord or foreign invader, everything changed. Panic spread like plague, gates slammed shut, markets were abandoned, bells rang from towers, not to rally the brave, but to prepare the terrified. And that's when the real siege began, inside the mind. Inside the castle walls, fear fermented. The defenders had no idea how many weeks or months they would be trapped inside. Every bite of food was counted. Every soldier was both a shield and a mouth to feed. The Lord's hall filled with the stench of sway, tea, rot, and prayers. Women clutched their children and stared at the walls as if they might disappear. The castle chapel, once a place of worship, became a confessional of despair. People started whispering, "Do we have enough? What if they break the gate? What if someone lets them in?" And that's when the terror tactics began. The besieging army didn't need to breach the walls, not yet. They could simply break the people inside. Prisoners were mutilated and marched in front of the castle, then hanged or burned alive within full view of the defenders. Severed heads of captured scouts or allies were fired by trebuchet back over the walls. Some were nailed to planks with written warnings. "You're next." But psychological warfare evolved further. Besiegers launched diseased corpses, often plague victims or animals, directly into water sources or key buildings like the chapel or the granary. The goal was not to kill immediately, but to infect, to spread dread as much as disease. And it worked. Inside the castle, suspicion grew like mold. Who was hoarding food? Who was sneaking messages to the enemy? Were there spies? Was someone poisoning the bread? Punishments were swift and public. A cook accused of theft might be boiled alive in oil. A guard suspected of betrayal could be thrown from the ramparts in front of the cheering crowd or hanged by his entrails. But even that wasn't enough to keep people calm, because there was a far worse fear than death by sword: starvation. In the depths of a siege, people began to break, not just in body but in mind. Chronic hunger strips away dignity. Mothers would beg the steward for crumbs. Fathers volunteered for suicide missions just to leave one less mouth to feed. In some sieges, like at Rochester in 1215 or Kenilworth in 1266, people began to eat anything. Boiled leer, the shoes, bark scraped from trees, rats caught in the drains, even the worn bodies of the dead, especially those who hadn't yet decomposed. But the breaking point was when mighty parents began killing their children. Not in cruelty, but in desperation. Sometimes it was to eat. Sometimes it was simply to spare them the suffering. These stories aren't myths. They are recorded, coldly, brutally, by chroniclers of the time, like Matthew Paris or the annals of siege accounts across France and England. And through all of this, the fear, the starvation, the madness, the people still clung to one terrifying hope: that the enemy would finally attack and end it. But the invaders had no need to rush. They had another weapon, one more cruel than all the rest: time. And time destroys everything. The ground trembled before anything struck. A low, rhythmic thud echoed across the valley, the heartbeat of a machine designed not just to kill, but to break. Forget the gallant knights charging with banners. This was the age of Shamnai's siege machines, monstrous wooden gods that hurled death from miles away. The trebuchet, the king of fear. Towering up to 60 feet tall and weighing several tons, the Schweiz counterweight trebuchet was the terror of castle walls. But its true power wasn't measured in stone, it was in psychological collapse. These machines could hurl 300-pound boulders over 300 yards, enough to cave in a stone wall, crush a guard tower, or shatter a chapel roof. But they weren't just used for rocks. Chroniclers recount how armies, especially during the Yuat siege of Kaffa, 1346, hurled the Hun rotting corpses of plague victims over city walls. It wasn't just about spreading disease, it was the message. We don't even need to touch you to kill you. They threw from severed heads, dead animals, and even such messages nailed to bones. And every time the people inside heard the creaking tension of the trebuchet arm, they didn't pray for mercy. They braced for what horror would fall next. Firepots, tar and grease, trebuchets evolved. Some launched ceramic pots filled with flaming pitch or wooing Greek fire, a napalm-like substance that stuck to walls, flesh and cloth, burning even in water. Others used barrels of human excrement, rotting food or animal guts, and not to kill but to rot morale, and more poison air. The message was simple. We don't just want your castle, we want your soul to break before the walls do. The silent killers, mining and undermining. But while the sky rained death, something far more sinister was happening. Beneath. Besiegers often dug tunnels under the castle walls, a method called undermining. These tunnels were propped up with wooden beams, which when burned or collapsed would cause entire sections of the wall to fall in a thunderous instant. The defenders often didn't even know until it was too late. Sometimes they heard muffled digging under the stone at night. In some sieges, counterminers dug tunnels of their own to intercept him, leading to deadly underground combat in pitch-black dirt chambers. Imagine fighting underground with no light, choking on dust, hearing the enemy scraping through just a few feet of earth. One wrong move and the tunnel collapses, burying you alive. Mining didn't just destroy walls, it destroyed one's sleep, sanity, and any sense of control. Siege towers, rolling monsters of war. When walls couldn't be breached, the attackers brought the battle to the sky. Siege towers, sometimes taller than the castle walls, were rolled across the battlefield. They bristled with archers, ladders, and battering rams. Covered in wet hides to prevent burning, these towers were slow but unstoppable. They loomed on the horizon for days, drawing closer inch by inch, like an approaching god of death. Defenders rained arrows to stones, boiling oil, and excrement down on them. But once the tower made contact, a bridge would drop and soldiers poured over the walls like locusts. It became hand-to-hand madness. There were no rules, no tactics, just the shrieking chaos of iron against flesh. Ladders, the butcher's path. In poorer sieges or moments of desperation, attackers used ladders. It sounds simple: climb, invade, conquer. But in truth, it was Schwann's suicide. Climbing a ladder under a hail of arrows, boiling tar and falling rocks meant you were likely to clutch or die before reaching the top. And even if you did, what waited was a man with an axe, ready to slice your fingers off the rung. Sometimes defenders used giant hooked poles to push ladders away, sending dozens of soldiers falling to their deaths, screaming the whole way down. Yet thousands attempted it, not out of hope, but because they had no other option. Blood and iron, the final breach. If siege engines succeeded, if the walls collapsed or the gates were smashed, the final assault began. What followed was not strategy, it was massacre. The first men through the breach were often slaughtered, but their corpses formed a path for the rest. Blood made the stones slippery. Screams echoed in the gate tunnels. Some attackers set fire to everything before the fight was over, including their own men. Inside, defenders were cornered in the halls and stairwells. It was no longer about survival. It was about taking as many with you as possible. Some fled to the chapel to pray. Others locked their women and children in cellars, and set them on fire, choosing death over rape and slavery. These were not battles, these were orgies of death. And no matter who won, the cost was always the same: ruin, death from above, below and within. Siege machines didn't just break walls, they broke people. They turned fields into wastelands, castles into crematoriums, and honor into the joke whispered between corpses. And worst of all, they forced people to ask the unthinkable: what's worse, surrendering or waiting for the walls to fall? There's a saying from an old siege: steel breaks walls, hunger breaks men. And in truth, the deadliest weapon in any siege wasn't the sword, the battering ram, or the trebuchet. It was time. Because once the gates were sealed and the harvest fields abandoned, the people inside the castle were not warriors. They were prisoners, surrounded by stone, fear, and nothing to eat. Time was the cruelest enemy. Most sieges didn't end with a final explosive assault. They ended with people collapsing from disease, from despair, from the knowledge that no one was coming. Months dragged on, then seasons. A siege wasn't a battle. It was a slow-motion death sentence. At the siege of Thessalonica in 1185, Byzantine sources tell of bodies piling in the streets, with dogs eating corpses and children hunting pigeons for meat. At Kenilworth Castle in 1266, the garrison endured 6 months of starvation before finally surrendering, filthy, skeletal, and half-mad. This was the true face of siege warfare, not sudden death, but slow decay. Disease, the hidden reaper. The close quarters of a castle under siege were a perfect breeding ground for illness. No sanitation, no fresh water, no space to isolate the sick, and no way out. Dysentery turned drinking water into poison. Typhus spread through lice-infested clothes. Gangrene infected even the smallest wounds. Plague could appear overnight, spread by rats feasting on corpses. The castle would begin to smell of death. Not metaphorically, but literally. The stench of rot, open wounds, unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and overflowing latrines. One chronicler during the siege of Acre in 1189 wrote that the air inside the walls became so thick with sickness that even those without wounds began to die. There were no doctors, no hope, just the long, wet coughing of the dying, echoing through the halls. Starvation, from famine to cannibalism. Food was always the first casualty. Grain stores ran out, livestock was slaughtered. Then came the turn of the rats, dogs, cats, bark peeled from trees, leather boiled from belts and shoes. At Rochester Castle, defenders were rumoured to have eaten their own horses, then shearing boiled animal bones to extract marrow. A desperate attempt to get any nutrition. But there's a darker truth, one that was rarely written in official records, yet whispered through history, in the most brutal sieges. People ate each other. At the one siege of Jerusalem in 1099, eyewitnesses claim that starving residents turned to watch cannibalism, boiling corpses in secrecy and guarding the meat like gold. Parents chose which child would eat and which one would be eaten. Some corpses were not yet dead when carved open. Morale, the real collapse. As food vanished, hope vanished too. Soldiers deserted. Civilians broke down. Some snuck out at night, only to be caught, tortured, and catapulted back into the castle as a warning. Others gave up entirely, wandering through the halls in delirium, whispering to saints, stripping naked, or sitting silently beside the dead. Suicide was common. Women threw themselves from towers to avoid what came after surrender. Men walked into enemy fire just to escape the waiting. The garrison's leader often faced mutiny. If not from his men, then from his own mind. Records show some lords killed their own wives and children before surrendering, believing death by hand was more merciful too. What would follow? The enemy inside the gates. Sometimes the enemy didn't need to break in. Betrayal was always lurking. A starving gatekeeper, a bribed servant, a desperate prisoner. One open door, even for a moment, and it was all over. At the siege of Château Gaillard in 1204, the French discovered a weak point, a latrine chute, and sent a single soldier crawling through. He opened a gate from inside. That one act ended years of resistance in a single night. It wasn't strength that killed the defenders. It was weakness inside the walls. A war of waiting. From the outside, a siege looked like patience, but inside it was chaos. The WAP food ledger became more important than any sword. The WAP rat population determined survival. Every sunrise dull was both a miracle and a curse, and all the while, the enemy simply waited, playing music, eating fresh meat, drinking wine in sight of the starving, mocking the people trapped within. Because they knew the siege didn't have to be won. The castle would fall all by itself. You've survived 6 months of siege. You haven't eaten in days. Your neighbors are dead. Your children are unrecognizable, pale, shaking, swollen-bellied from hunger. The gate finally creaks open. You think it's over? But what walks through that gate isn't mercy, it's vengeance. Because in the medieval world, a surrendered castle was not always spared, and a taken one, never. The terms of surrender, a lie. In theory, surrender could buy survival. A castle garrison might negotiate terms with the besieging army, the promise of safe passage or clemency for the lord's family. Flags of truce were raised, hostages exchanged, words of honor spoken. But medieval warfare was notoriously fickle. Promises often meant nothing. A lord could soon change his mind after seeing the damage done to his army. A commander might see surrender as a sign of weakness, or worse, treason. At the Bourcos siege of Béziers in 1209, Catholic crusaders promised to spare civilians if the town surrendered heretics. When the gates were opened, the army slaughtered everyone inside. Up to 20,000 men, women and children. One commander reportedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Massacres without mercy. In siege warfare, no quarter given meant exactly that. No prisoners, no survivors, no distinction between soldier or civilian. Sometimes it was revenge, sometimes it was policy. At the siege of Jerusalem, 1099, crusaders stormed the city after a brutal siege. They massacred Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians, killing so many that blood ran through the streets ankle deep, according to eyewitnesses. Men were butchered in the mosques, women dragged into alleyways, children slain in courtyards. It wasn't about conquest anymore, it was about cleansing, purging the place of its memory. What happened to the women? For women, surrender often meant something worse than death. Noble women were seized as prizes, raped, held hostage, or married off as trophies. Common women were stripped, paraded, beaten, and handed out among soldiers. Some were forced to walk naked through the rubble of their homes while being mocked and spit on. Many were murdered after rape, to prevent pregnancies or just for sport. At the Pschornol sack of Magdeburg in 1631, one of the most infamous sieges in Europe's history, an estimated 20,000 civilians were killed. Countless women were raped in churches, their infants thrown against walls or burned alive in cribs. This wasn't the exception, it was the ritual of war, repeated across centuries, empires, and faiths. The fate of children. Children fared no better. Infants were thrown from walls or spitted on swords as trophies. Older children were sometimes dragged into slavery, if they were lucky. Others were used as warnings, hung from the battlements, burned in public, or buried alive. In the Siege of Limoges, 1370, English forces under the Black Prince slaughtered thousands, including children. The reasoning? The city had dared to resist, and children born in rebellion would one day become enemies. A dead child was seen as a future soldier defeated early. Destruction of the castle itself. Once the people were broken, the stone had to fall next. Siege victors often demolished the castles they took, especially if the stronghold had been a site of rebellion. This was not just strategy, it was beyond symbolism. Walls were pulled down stone by stone, often using the labor of the captured. Gatehouses were blasted open or filled with rubble. Entire keeps were burned from the inside, their interiors desecrated. In some cases, the castle chapel was the first to be defiled. The altar overturned, relics destroyed, sacred images pissed on or worse. Because to conquer a castle fully, its memory had to die too. Survivors, if they lived at all, those who lived through it were never the same. Some were dragged away in chains to be sold as slaves or paraded through enemy cities. Some were blinded so they could never fight again. Some had their ears, noses, or hands cut off as a permanent mark of defeat. Others were simply left behind in the ruins to rebuild, scavenge, or starve again. There are reports of survivors wandering the countryside, dressed in rags, eyes hollow, hands shaking. They were not considered heroes. They were broken things. Reminders of what happened when a castle fell. Total annihilation as a message. In the end, destroying a castle wasn't always about strategy. It was about sending a message to rivals, to vassals, to the people. Resist us, and we will make you disappear. This was medieval warfare's darkest truth. The siege didn't end when the walls fell. It ended when no one was left to remember them. It's easy to believe castle sieges belong to the past. Stone walls, flaming arrows, and battering rams feel like the relics of a brutal, forgotten time. But the horrors of siege warfare never disappeared. They just evolved. And the deeper you look into what truly happened during medieval sieges, the more you realize we're still living with their legacy. Psychological warfare never ended. The tactics used during castle sieges, starvation, isolation, terror, were not primitive. They were precise, intentional, designed to break minds before bodies. Today we call them psychological operations, but the goals remain identical: to isolate civilians, to destroy morale, to incite despair and surrender without a fight. In medieval sieges, bodies were catapulted over walls. Today, propaganda videos and drone footage serve the same purpose. In both cases, the message is the same. We are in control of your life and death. Siege has become modern. We like to imagine medieval siege warfare as distant, crude machines and stone towers, but modern cities have become castles, and the methods are alarmingly familiar. Grozny, Aleppo, Mariupol. Modern siege warfare grinds cities to dust through encirclement, starvation, and indiscriminate bombing. Civilians in basements, like peasants in keeps, eat what they can, sleep where they can, wait for the horror to pass. Or not. Aid convoys become modern Nisu supply wagons. Cut off deliberately. Infrastructure, power, water, medicine is targeted to break the people, not just the soldiers. In medieval times, fire pots and diseased corpses were launched over walls. Today, airstrikes and sanctions achieve the same thing, slowly, strategically, mercilessly. The technology has changed, but the cruelty has not. The myth of chivalry. Popular media still paints medieval war as noble. Gallant knights in shining armor, honorable duels, fair sieges with clean endings. But history shows something else entirely. Knights massacred civilians after breaching walls, lords betrayed truces, and burned churches. Rape, torture, cannibalism, and mutilation were commonplace, not rare. There was no age of honor, only power, desperation, and a willingness to survive at any cost. Modern culture has sanitized medieval war, stripping it of its filth, trauma, and horror. But the people who lived through those sieges would tell a different story. if they lived long enough to speak at all, the resilience of the human spirit. And yet, amid all the horror, something else emerges, a strange, powerful testament to what people can endure. Mothers who boiled bark to feed their children, priests who kept praying beside piles of dead, soldiers who held the walls for 6 months with no hope of rescue, civilians who chose to stay, not flee, even when they knew what was coming. These weren't just stories of destruction, they were stories of resilience, of people facing the worst of humanity and refusing to die quietly. That's what makes the history of sieges so important, not just for their cruelty, but for the sheer impossibility of survival and how some managed it anyway. Why we remember. We study battles, kings, conquerors, but we rarely hear about the charman baker who starved beside his oven, the one child who lived 3 months without sunlight, the one servant who snuck food to the chapel, knowing they'd be beaten for it. They're the ghosts in these stories, then unseen, unsung, but they're the ones who show us what war really is. Sieges strip war down to its core. They remove the fantasy, the glory, the illusion. What's left is the truth. That war is waiting, not fighting. Was that death often comes quietly, not with a sword, that cruelty thrives in confinement, and that what humans can endure more than we should ever have to, from stone to silence. Today, most castles are ruins, tourist sites, picture-perfect relics of a romanticized past. But beneath every stone, every tower, every shattered gate, lies a memory. Of walls that kept people in, not out. Of battlements where mothers watched their sons die. Of chambers where lords ordered executions because they had no choice. What really happened during castle sieges wasn't chivalry. It was survival. It was madness. It was humanity stripped raw. And if we forget that, we risk repeating it. For centuries, castle sieges have been retold in legend, filled with heroic last stands, noble lords, and epic defenses. But the real stories, hidden in medieval manuscripts and eyewitness chronicles, are darker, stranger, more horrifying. They reveal what really happened. Inside the walls when the world outside had already died. These are not myths. These are horror recorded events. And they show just how far humans can go to survive, to resist, or to destroy each other. The Siege of Rochester Castle, 1215, starving to death in stone. In 1215, during King John's war against rebellious barons, Rochester Castle in England became the scene of one of the most brutal sieges in English history. King John's men used undermining tactics, digging tunnels beneath a key tower and setting fire to the support beams, causing the entire structure to collapse. But the defenders didn't surrender. They simply retreated deeper into the ruined keep, living among rubble without food, drinking fouled water surrounded by rotting corpses. Chroniclers describe a hellish standoff, men surviving on mobbed horseflesh, then eating leather boots, and the wounded being left to rot in corners of the hall. Desperation so intense that men chewed raw hides, nailed to the walls. When they finally surrendered, King John was so furious at their resistance that he wanted them hanged. He was only persuaded to spare them because many were noble-born, but the castle never recovered. Its very stones had become haunted by starvation. The Siege of St. Scholastica's Abbey, 845. Cannibalism in a convent. In 845, the city of Pavia, Italy, was besieged by Saracen forces. One of their key targets was St. Scholastica's Abbey, a convent of noble-born nuns thought to be hiding treasure. As the siege dragged on and supplies dwindled, reports from Lombard sources tell of unspeakable horror inside the abbey. Nuns boiling, parchment manuscripts meant to create soup, rats and insects becoming daily meals, women cutting flesh from the dead and drying it to last longer. One report, disputed but widely believed at the time, claimed that a group of starving nuns offered themselves to be eaten, praying that their sacrifice would allow the others to survive. When the attackers finally breached the convent, they found only 5 women still alive. Skeletal, unrecognizable, sitting in silence, surrounded by bones. The siege wasn't famous, but it stands as one of the earliest recorded examples of sheer, female-led resistance and starvation warfare. The Siege of Sancerre, 1572 to 1573. The Rat War. Sancerre was a French Huguenot stronghold during the Wars of Religion. The Catholics besieged the city, cutting it off for 8 full months. Inside, the Protestant defenders, men, women, children, lived in increasingly apocalyptic conditions. They ate rats and leather, even boiling books for sustenance. They dug up graves and removed bones to create room for the dying. One worried to Bamu Mountain. Oman reportedly killed her newborn child out of mercy. She feared the baby would cry and be heard by the enemy. But perhaps the most harrowing fact, the city never formally surrendered. When the siege was lifted, over 500 people had died of starvation. Yet the walls remained standing. The price of that resistance, an entire generation had traumatized, their city filled with silence and graves. The Siege of Château Gaillard, 1203 to 1204. Betrayal through the latrine. Built by King Richard the Lionheart, Château Gaillard was considered impregnable. Its walls were thick, its towers massive, and its cliffs unreachable. But in 1203, the French laid siege to it, and what followed proved that even the strongest castle can fall to the weakest link. After months of conventional siege warfare, a French soldier discovered a latrine chute that led up into one of the lower chapels. He climbed through the filth and emerged inside the castle, alone. That single breach allowed him to unlock a gate, and within hours the French stormed in, slaughtering defenders. Dozens were killed mid-prayer in the chapel. Others fled to the upper keep, where they were burned alive. Women and children were thrown from the walls in panic. It wasn't the trebuchets or the famine that brought Château Gaillard down. It was a pond toilet. And the castle's reputation never recovered. The Siege of Jerusalem, 1099, massacre in the Holy City, one of the most infamous sieges in human history. After a long and punishing siege during the First Crusade, Crusader forces broke into Jerusalem and began what many consider to be a religiously driven genocide. Eyewitness accounts, both Christian and Muslim, describe blood running knee-deep through the streets, entire populations slaughtered inside mosques and synagogues, children burned alive as symbols of cleansing, captives forced to carry rotting corpses to mass graves. One Crusader chronicler wrote proudly, "In the Temple of Solomon, our men rode in blood, up to their knees." This wasn't conquest, it was annihilation, fueled by faith, fear, and the psychology of siege warfare gone mad. The Siege of Limoges, 1370. Mercy was forgotten. Limoges was a city in France that had declared allegiance to the English crown. But in 1370, when the city changed sides, the English returned with fury. Led by Edward, the Black Prince, the army laid siege to Limoges, and when they broke through the walls, they unleashed hell. Contemporary accounts claim over 3,000 people were slaughtered, many of them civilians. Entire families burned inside their homes, churches desecrated, women raped beside the altars. The brutality was so severe that even Edward's own chroniclers tried to downplay the numbers, afraid it would damage his reputation. But the survivors remembered. They wrote in blood. Why these stories matter. These aren't just tales of brutality, they're lessons. That power does not protect the innocent. That even the strongest walls can fall from within. That war always turns inward until the mind breaks. Sieges didn't just happen to castles. They happened inside people, in their stomachs, in their minds, in their morality. And when the gates finally opened, the people who emerged were not the same as those who walked in. From the outside, a medieval castle is a symbol of power, massive towers, impenetrable gates, flags fluttering in the wind. It screams dominance, security, invincibility. But inside those walls, a very different story unfolds. Because when the siege begins, when the gates close and the world collapses, a castle doesn't feel like a fortress. It feels like a trap. And the more you understand what happened during medieval sieges, the more you realize castles didn't just protect people from enemies, they also protected the Jabuju. Worldwide and from what people became inside. Castles as tools of psychological control, A castle wasn't just stone and mortar, it was an instrument of fear. But for the lord, it projected power, a warning to vassals and rivals. Don't rise, don't rebel. For the peasants, it was a place to run, but also a place they could be locked inside, trapped by the very walls they thought would save them. For enemies, it represented a challenge, a prize, a political symbol worth destroying at any cost. Sieges stripped castles of their illusion. What was once a palace became a child prison, a child charnel house, a mass grave with banners. The myth of safety. History is filled with stories of people fleeing to castles for protection, only to die more slowly than if they had faced their enemies in the open. The thick walls meant no escape. The high towers meant you watched your own doom approaching for days. The lack of supplies meant every extra person was a liability. During sieges, castle inhabitants often begged to be let out. Not to flee, but to surrender, even if it meant death. Castles didn't always save lives. Sometimes they just delayed the inevitable, drawing out the suffering. Castles protected power, not people. At their core, castles were designed to protect rulers, not civilians. The lord had private stores of food. His family had escape routes, tunnels, hidden gates, or deals with the enemy. The peasants, they were the meat shield, the labor, the fuel. In siege after siege, we see a recurring pattern. The noble survives, the soldiers surrender. The civilians suffer the worst. In some cases, lords bartered their people's lives for their own safety. They opened the gates after securing a truce for themselves, leaving their subjects to face massacre, rape, or slavery. So when we ask, what did castles really protect? The answer is simple: the power at the top. What castles couldn't protect. For all their stone and steel, castles were powerless against what really broke people. Starvation, plague, madness, betrayal, time. No wall could hold off dysentery, no gate could stop the loss of hope, no battlement could defend against the slow decay of the human mind when cut off from the world. And when the siege ended, even if the walls stood tall, what was inside had already fallen. Castles were human experiments. What happens when you take hundreds of people, men, women, children, and lock them inside stone walls for months? You see the truth of human nature. You see kindness turn into charm, self-preservation. Order collapse into suspicion. Piety unravel into castles, desperation. And courage give way to cannibalism. Castles under siege were not static places. They were psychological crucibles, where fear, hunger, and power twisted human behavior into something unrecognizable. What castles couldn't protect people from was themselves. The ghosts still linger. Visit any ruined castle today and listen. You won't hear the clang of armor or the cheers of victory. You'll feel the silence. Because behind the tourist signs and reconstructed towers, there are shadows. Of mothers rocking children who never stopped crying. Of lords ordering executions just to maintain order. Of priests weeping beside piles of corpses. Of people kneeling at the altar, not for salvation, but for food. These places hold more than history. They hold personal trauma, unspoken, unwritten, but still very much alive, in the stones. Why we must remember. It's tempting to romanticize the past, to imagine that war was more honourable, that castles were symbols of glory, that the people inside them were strong, brave and clean. But the truth is far more human and far more horrifying, because what ally happened during castle sieges is not a story of walls falling, it's a story of people breaking. And the only way to honour those who suffered is to tell the truth. Not the story that flatters our love of knights and banners, but the one that reveals the whole terrifying cost of survival. So the next time you stand before a castle and admire its beauty, remember what it was built for and what it could never protect. Thank you for watching this documentary from Auric History. If this opened your eyes to a darker, more human side of the past, like this video, and subscribe for more stories that history tried to bury. And tell me in the comments, which siege story affected you the most?